Welcome to the Talent Revolution, Tales from the Trenches. I'm Jill Caniglio-Kirk.
And I'm Joe Shambum. Welcome to the show, everyone. And we have a fantastic special guest with us, Michelle Cass, who is a forward-thinking leadership and talent strategist, known for championing human-centered approaches in an increasingly AI-driven world of work. She's the author of Hired by Humanity, where she explores how organizations can blend technology with empathy to build stronger, more connected teams. Through her work, she's helped leaders rethink how they attract, engage, and lead talent by putting people, not processes, at the center of every decision. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Joe and Jill. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us.
Anything else you would like to add, Michelle? Introduce yourself.
So I've spent my career really helping organizations rethink how they hire and how they lead, especially in very complex, high growth environments. What drives me, I think, is building those systems where people can truly thrive, because when you get the human side right, performance will follow. And that's really the foundation behind my work and my book, Hired by Humanity.
Well, it's exciting to have you on with us, and I am really excited to dig into this topic of human-centered leadership. So when I know our listeners are a lot of HR people, we have a lot of other people from other leadership disciplines. I guess I'm going to start with the most basic question of all, which is, what really is human-centered leadership, Michelle?
Sure. So human-centered leadership is the intentional design of environments where people can perform, grow, and really feel that sense of belonging all at the same time. It's about choosing empathy over performance, and it's about understanding that empathy really enables performance. So when people feel seen and supported and connected to a purpose, they're going to show up differently, and they think differently, and they contribute differently. So for me, that human-centered leadership is about putting people first, not in a way that really lowers the standards, but in a way that actually allows people to meet and exceed them. So I think there is a misconception that empathy and performance are in tension, and they're really not. Empathy will give you context, and it helps you understand what's really driving behavior, where somebody might be struggling or what's motivating them. And when you have that level of understanding, you can certainly lead more effectively. So performance still matters, don't get me wrong, but clarity and accountability are and those expectations, they don't go away, but how you deliver that as a leader really changes everything. So I think the best leaders I've seen are incredibly clear on expectations and really equally strong on how they support their people in achieving those expectations. It's not the empathy or performance, it's the empathy that's driving the performance.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen it different? Because I know your background goes through many different types of companies, and I know Jill and I have been in more probably engineering related side of things. And again, all the listeners will be across different disciplines and areas. Is there a difference within tech and engineering, manufacturing, anything that way that you've seen?
Honestly, I think, it's really how you show up, and it's all about consistency in leadership, right? So I don't think it matters the industry that you're in. Again, manufacturing, financial services, life sciences, I've been, in healthcare. I think it really is consistency across the board.
And then how do you get the leaders to understand that? Because, when you hear the word empathy, some people may take it the wrong way of, I've got to be not soft, but nicer, right? Or whatever. Like, how do you coach and train that?
Yeah, I think it's really, that say-do, right? And being able to build trust, the say-do ratio of taking everything from ensuring what you say and what you do are consistent, right? And you have to do that every time for sure. So I think that's critical. And in building that trust with your team and with the leaders and with other key stakeholders within the organization. And then really, again, leaning in and ensuring ensuring that you're coaching them appropriately, that you're going through kind of that change management piece, that communication is consistent, and then creating those standards within the process, right? And consistency overall.
Yeah, one thing I'm hearing that's ringing through this conversation, what you're describing to me, Michelle, is that this is really a process and there's multiple building blocks, right, for leaders that kind of are components of laying this type of foundation. And I'm sure there are people out there saying like, well, where do I start, right? And it sounds like some of this do what you say, right? And be kind of demonstrating and, kind of like walking the talk, so to speak, is where to start. Is that a good summary of if a person out there were looking at like, okay, I'm a leader. I don't know. I haven't reflected on these things. I haven't done these things. How can I maybe go through a process and examine some of these important aspects? What would you advise them to do? And where's a good place to start?
Absolutely. It is a process, right? It's creating those standards, but it's also, looking at kind of the old way of thinking where it's sort of that command and control piece. And it's really about replacing control with trust, and then replacing hierarchy with a connection, and then compliance, which is the old adage, right? Replacing that compliance with commitment. So I think if you're centered in, trust and connection and commitment, I think things will fall into place.
I'm
so is there like a
through,
framework in that sense? Is there besides your book maybe, but is there a model that's other folks could download, let's just call it, in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think my book does go through that model. It really kind of is that playbook that you can use. But again, I think it goes through the standards, right? And being able to build those relationships, just being focused on the human elements and the person that you're engaging with, right? Building that trust with them, developing that relationship with them over time, and doing what you say you're going to do. I think all of those things are critical. But definitely my book is really that playbook that walks you through that human-centered approach.
and I would just say other parts of that are having your team members, the people that report to you, feeling like it's a safe space, right?
Right.
Feeling like they feel connected to you. They feel like they're connected to the team. They're connected to you. To me, it's like try to build this two-way process rather than this one-way process. Sometimes you have to give to get, right? And you have to kind of share and be open in order to really kind of, maybe that's not, you have to kind of take the walk to get there with people. But the more that you model what you want them to do, the more that you might kind of see that coming back to you.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm also interested, I can certainly resonate with the situation of I have team members that I'm physically present with regularly, and then I have direct reports or even indirect reports that I don't have that physical time with. I don't have that in-office experience with, right? And I think a lot of leaders kind of struggle with how do I balance that out? How do I put together a game plan for myself where I don't have that proximity, I don't have that physical opportunity to kind of still do this in the right way and still have an equally strong, relationship? Maybe you can share some of your thoughts and views there, or some advice to our listeners that might be kind of going through that.
Absolutely. So I think, again, hybrid work, right, is definitely where we are today. Lots of remote work exists. So a lot of folks have a lot of questions just around that, right? How do you build that human-centered approach in a virtual environment? And I think it comes down to, I've had distributed TA teams, and really instead of, tracking hours or activity, we align on clear metrics, right? So time from a recruiting perspective, it's time to fill, quality of hire, stakeholder satisfaction, and then create weekly operating rhythms where we show progress. And, I think over time, if you give people that clear direction, and give them the autonomy, they'll definitely be more successful and perform at a higher level for sure. So, but it's about having those one-on-ones, right? Making sure that when you're having those one-on-ones, that you're asking them the right questions, that you're showcasing that you care and that you're thinking of them and as a person, versus just an employee, right? So I think that's critical, and engaging with them in a genuine way, being transparent and open, and just keeping those lines of communication open, and talking to them on a personal level as well, not just about work, right? It's just developing that relationship.
Mhm.
So how do you recruit for that? I mean, there's probably lots of questions, but I mean, is there a good way to do it?
Yeah, honestly, I think, when you're recruiting, I'm very much about attitude, right? I think when you're looking at somebody and you're interviewing them for a role, they have to be the right culture fit, right? They have to have the right attitude. It's not necessarily all just about their qualifications, but if they can operate kind of in that environment, and have that positive attitude going into it, I think that always goes a long way. But it's asking those right questions, right? Knowing, if they're a culture fit, and having that dialogue with them about the organization, and do they, attribute to or align to the values of the organization as well. I think that's key and critical too. And you can potentially do some assessments upfront to ensure that they're culturally aligned with the organization as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes the simplest questions tell you the most in the sense of, so tell me, in leading your team, how do you lead? What does that look like? And you kind of just give them really no cues as to what you want to hear, right? So you're not
Right.
you're not throwing a strike right over the plate saying, I've already told you what the right answer is, right? It's such a open, vague question where someone starts that, and what they might convey there could be very telling of what makes them tick, what is their nature as a leader. I feel like sometimes in interviews we kind of say too much to not necessarily, right, just really let things evolve naturally. And I know that's something that I've tried to get better at, because I think the more you're into HR or TA or other things, sometimes the simplest, most basic questions actually can kind of get you the best information, because you're not steering, right? You're not prompting anyone. So
right, exactly.
That's something that, I think Joe made a comment to me before today's episode saying sometimes Jill's over prepared. I would say I'm not going to disagree with that comment, Joe, because I could, kind of see in my own career where I've evolved to kind of being a little bit more open in those regards. Because when Joe's, when you're asked that question of Michelle saying, how do I find that out? To me, the best way is, when you give somebody kind of that blank slate, where do they start? What things do they start talking about? What's most important to them? So, anyway,
silence helps too. It's fun. A lot of folks don't like silence, especially in interviews or conversations, and then they start talking about anything, right, because of the silence. And there was a story behind that in an interview process where I was told that's what you have to do, Joe, was ask the question and then stay silent and then listen and watch what the person does. I think the other part about the interviewing piece is, and we talked about hybrid and offsite, but it's coming in, it's meeting them in person, watching and learning what do they do, how do they work and interact with everyone, or if they're going to dinner, especially for leadership roles, right? You're doing more than one and different environments to be able to really learn about that person.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
I guess I'm curious, Michelle, if you've experienced a case where you were really able to help guide and steer someone who maybe wasn't self-aware, maybe they didn't really understand what they were projecting, and maybe help them go through a process to really implement some of these strategies and techniques that, you know, kind of help them as a leader get to better outcomes from their team, better performance from their team. Are there any examples you have of cases where, you know, you help someone?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had someone on my team, a manager on my team that was, having some challenges. He was very technically skilled, but having some challenges with his overall leadership style and really getting the results from his team. So I spent some time sitting in on some of his meetings, and what I gleaned from that really was just, he, rather than engaging with the team and asking for input, he was really driving the conversation and, basically more of a top-down approach, not, asking the team questions, not being necessarily a good listener. So it was some very simple shifts, right? So just, I prompted him as he's having these meetings with his teams, just be more of an active listener, ask for their input, pause, give them time to provide that input, create that safe space for them, right? And that transparent, open door kind of approach. And things definitely got better, right? So the performance on his team improved. I think overall they felt more engaged with him as a leader, and definitely performance improved overall. So it's a good.
I'm curious in that case, like whether there was some initial pushback or denial of, no, that's not what I'm doing. Right? Like I could see, like, was there a blind spot potentially? And then once they kind of understood it, they wanted to confront it. Or, I'm just thinking realistically about the defensive nature of when you are in that situation with a leader. There's this natural ability to say, well, that's not what I'm trying to do. And that's not what, right?
Yeah. I think over time, yes, I think initially, there was some pushback, but, I was able to provide some pretty detailed examples and maybe some ideas on how to shift that approach. So it definitely got better for sure. And he was more open.
Mm-hmm. One of the points you brought up, I think, are so important, and it's kind of difficult to do, but that observation phase for you was probably really key in knowing what the problem was. Because I think often, as an HR professional, you're hearing about problems from one side or the other, from the leader side or from the employee side, and there's unknowns, right? So I think, like, if there's any opportunity, that observation part of it definitely tells the whole story. I just think I could see myself hearing one side of this and jumping to conclusions that may not be completely well informed without having that observation. So I think, anyway, that gives me some ideas for maybe some things I could do better, or potentially, just remind myself of, and saying, yeah, watch, there's nothing better than, putting yourself in the heart of it. And if there's opportunities like that, to kind of see how the two-way dynamics play out, right? Because you could probably also read the other people in the room and how they're feeling, and they might be closed and other things that maybe the leader has just a blind spot to, right? Okay. The other thing I could think about in that example is that leader might not know other way because they were always led the same way. I'm sure that's a pattern you see as well. Like, I emulate what has been modeled to me, right? So I believe this is the right way to lead, and they believe this is the way to get the outcomes they need, right? To me, I can certainly see, like, that being a dynamic that, repeats itself.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I actually went through some management training, like an 18-month course that was kind of built off of, top leaders, right? So they assessed, top leaders within various organizations, and they built this course around it. And what was so interesting is as a manager, right, I was doing things wrong, right, based on how top leaders lead, but I was emulating the performance of the managers that managed me. So a lot of times there are no management courses, right? We're typically, join an organization and we're promoted into management, and we emulate the behaviors of the people that led us. Absolutely.
I think that brings a great point of training leaders to listen and watch and know what to look for. Jill, to your point on, being able to observe it, HR is usually not in the room for those things, right? So it's how do we train our leaders to be able to see those things and be able to actively listen, to be able to help coach, right? Because everybody's a coach. Michelle, you said one word which reminded me even to the next piece on that word prompt. AI is in every conversation and in every world, and no podcast episode would never be complete without talking about AI. So, how does AI play into this? Have you thought of that or seen examples of the AI world now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's really the crux of my book, right? So AI, in my mind, should be an accelerant, right? It should not replace the human elements. And I think it's critical for organizations to adopt AI, but I think it's really learning how to leverage it in the right ways without replacing the judgment that the human element brings. So, I think if you have that strong sort of human-centered culture, AI will make it more effective overall. But if you don't, it's going to expose a lot of the gaps within your organization. So it is truly critical.
That mean, like, what would people example of using AI for, but has to keep it human? I guess let's share that a little bit more with some folks.
Yeah. So I think, it certainly can make your process better. So you're going to gain efficiencies by leveraging AI, but leverage AI for the right thing. So in recruiting, maybe part of the sourcing pieces, right? Or that initial outreach, or some of the screening elements, a lot of the administrative tasks within the process. But you want to bring that recruiter or that human element back in for those higher touch point pieces of the process. And then it's going to give time back, right? Because you can automate a lot of the administrative burden of your work. It's going to give time back to have those more high touch moments with your candidates, with your hiring leaders, and with key stakeholders within the organization. So, I think that's definitely key, is automating the right pieces of the process.
And that's on TA side of things, and I agree. I mean, those will definitely efficiencies. And maybe Jill, you want to chime in on this. What about the HR side, right? I mean, AI seems to be a little less, I'm going to say, obvious in the HR side, process side of it. Besides creating a document or, designing something, how else can AI play into the HR side of it?
It is going to help create job descriptions, right? I mean, you can do research on compensation, overall benefits, and then basically tailor what you need, right? So you'll still have to have that human element in, but you can pull in a lot of the administrative tasks within the HR function as well, to automate, like I said, job descriptions, compensation details, benefits details, that, and then again, allowing for, the HR leadership to have more strategic, higher level, human-centered connections.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity, obviously, for efficiency gains. Where I get worried about AI interfering is, like, it's very, very tempting to say, could I build a chatbot that knows everything about all my policies and that has every answer to every question every employee could possibly dream up? And anyone that's been an HR person saying, I hear you, I got the craziest questions from people, but if I can build a machine that can answer all those questions, wouldn't that be wonderful? I would be interrupted constantly, right? And it's like kind of this euphoria state. But then I would argue that while that's very tempting, then you're missing out on this opportunity to connect with the actual people in your organization, right? And understand, what else might I find out during the conversation with them about that very transactional question, like how they're doing, what's going on in their team, right? How are they feeling about things, on and on and on, right? So I could see there's a slippery slope there. I can see both sides of it, right? I don't think going too far in either direction makes sense. So it's kind of, how do I find that sweet spot,
Yeah.
which everyone knows I'm a golfer, so I'm always using my analogies. They just slip out. It's not intentional. But how do I find that sweet spot, right? And what does that look like in my organization? Because it could be very, very different in a high-tech company that's very, professional workforce, white collar, right? Have you versus, manufacturing company, right? So I think everyone needs to reflect on those things and think about those items for themselves. But I do think there's a temptation there of maybe going too far, where we kind of now become very, more disconnected, right? We kind of live in our silos. We disconnect from the organization.
Then you lose
And
that trust, right?
of course, we're only like examining that HR, pillar right now and talking about the HR function, but we could take that through every other function, right? And say, if this is how our organizations operate and live, what do we really become, right? And how does that degrade our performance as a team and as one company? And how does that impact the overall, right, place that we're going? So I think those are really interesting questions. If I had the answers to them, I'd be a gazillionaire. But I think they're relevant topics that, leaders need to be thinking about and talking about in their leadership teams to kind of understand, how do we want to embrace this? How do we want to use this? What efficiencies do we want to get? But what culture do we still want to preserve, right? And
Absolutely.
how could all of these things come to play with potentially having an impact on that culture and climate and, the personal aspects of engagement and other things. So
We're still dealing with humans, right? So, regardless if AI is in there, there's still humans, and we need to interact. We need to build trust, earn trust, and connect together. And that's, you can't lose that. You can build around it, but the core still guys into that, and that trust factor and learning and active listening all plays into that stuff. Jill, I know you've got to have one of these things because we have our tales from the trenches. So anything you'd like to share as a good tidbit and story for our listeners?
Well, I'm never shy. I'm never shy about having an opinion on things. And I would just say, if I think about human-centered leadership and an example of really how it's changed me as a leader, I would just say, walking into a new organization, the most important piece for me as a leader is really saying, how do I get to know these individuals that I lead as people? Because I know from my own perspective, how everyone likes to be led and what they need from their leader is different, right? So I would just say, recently going through a transition, changing positions, having a new team to lead. It's not a easy process. It's not something that happens overnight, right? But I think you need to start taking steps to keep building on that, right? And it's really through investing time with your team and asking the questions. And, some of what Michelle really talked about is, I need to figure out who these people are, what makes them tick, what's most important to them. For some of them, missing a one-on-one meeting with them or rescheduling it is like, oh my gosh, you would swear it was the end of the earth. For other people, it's like, they can't wait for me to cancel a meeting with them, right? They're busy, they got things to do. They'll call me, don't call them, right? So I would just say, part of human-centered leadership is knowing that not everybody on your team wants or needs the same things. And, the truth of the matter is, even if people say they don't want certain things, that doesn't mean you don't give them their access to you and time with you and other things. I think that's a slippery slope and a potential pitfall for leaders. But having that consideration of where people are at and what they need from you is an important aspect of this conversation around human-centered leadership. And I'll also say that some people really throw up the signs that they don't want to connect with you and they want to kind of keep things very to the point into business. And I would just argue to say that your relationship is going to be stalled and their productivity is probably going to be stalled at some point if there's not this openness and this trusted environment and, all of the other things we talked about here. So I would just say I have some recent experience with building new relationships, with people and people that report to me. And that's just a little bit of a reflection on my journey.
You bring up a couple points there, Jill, on some stories. I've had several of them where there's few of them that, I don't need a one-on-one, Joe. And it's like, okay, but I'm here when you're ready, right? And, it's messaging them saying, hey, how are you? Even though they don't want to do the small talk or whatever, but it's that touching, that touch base that really connects with them, and you're there for them when you're ready. The other piece of, say, a story that came into it was there was somebody that was struggling, and there was some pressure of, hey, their performance needs to kick up, and really it's diving into what was going on and having that conversation with the person. And there were some personal things, right? And you're not going to fire them for some personal things, but performance is starting to drive, so you got to balance this act. And I ended up being lenient and work through a plan to be able to support them, which then tenfold over, they really appreciated it. And next thing you know, they're a superstar, right? Because they were able to work through what they were doing on that personal level, didn't lower expectations, but we were able to manage the expectations, right, because we understood what was going on and we're able to talk through that. So they, even though they didn't want to open up, and that's okay, but they shared enough to be able to understand, to be able to work with them. And that was the openness behind it, to be able to then, I took some heat to get pressure of where things were and the output of different pieces, and that's okay, but that's my job, to be able to support your employee, to be able to then, prove out that they are worth it. They're very capable. They're just a situation, and it worked out awesome that way. And, the person's still a really good friend, and we've driven on different avenues, and that's what it means. And then not everyone's going to end up being friends and stuff, but that emotional support really played through it all. And it really, you remember it's those lasting memories.
Right. Yeah. And then I would just say, I think over time, if you kind of put the effort in, and like you said, sometimes people are kind of closed at first, the results follow on both sides, right? They probably get more in return from their leader. Their performance then somehow is reflective of having more guidance, right? Having more direction, having assistance in prioritizing, or whatever those things are. So I would just say, it's a process. It's a journey. It happens in small steps. It happens through daily actions, not through once a month anything. It's an everyday thing. And Michelle, I'm sure, you've probably got some closing remarks for our listeners as far as maybe giving them some words of wisdom or inspiration,
or even a couple of takeaways that they could summarize into it. Yeah, that would be awesome for us.
Yeah, no, I think, just to tie into what you guys were saying too, it's not just about those big moments, right? And recognizing the big moments. It's about recognizing all the moments along the way that really are going to help, build that trust with your team, and with, other stakeholders, right? And showcasing that recognition piece, right, from a human-centered perspective. But I think it's critical that we all stay on the AI journey, right? And I think the message around my book is really all about just make sure that you focus on that human-centered piece. Don't completely eliminate that, because it will affect the culture of your organization tremendously, and you will lose people. Your turnover will be higher. So I think it's really just make sure that you're focused on that. And then from a recruiting perspective, that whole candidate experience piece, it's critical that you have that human touch in place as well.
100%. Michelle, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate you joining us. It was an awesome conversation. Jill, anything on your side?
Yeah, no, I'm leaving inspired. I'm leaving smarter. I'm leaving with some personal notes for myself, to say, are there things I can do better? Absolutely. I think we all can. And just, thoughts around really how we frame these AI considerations and make sure that we're not, missing out on we're creating new problems, right? We're solving we're solving old problems, but we're creating 10 new ones, right? Nobody wants to do that. So we got to proceed carefully and thoughtfully through that process. But loved having you on, Michelle. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you joining us again, Michelle. Remember, everyone, we are still human. So don't forget that out of all of these things. So thanks for listening and watching. Till next time, this is the Tales from the Trenches, and have a great night.